Glad you're here this morning. I had a rough week with the flu. I'm standing before you. So what happens when pastor's substitute gets sick, right? Then we start going to the deacon's neck. So we just barely spared them preaching this morning. This morning I have a message for you about the story of Joseph of the Old Testament. I love the story of Joseph. I could just read it over and over again. It is actually one of the longest stories about a person in the Old Testament, especially in the book of Genesis. And his story is found in Genesis chapter 37 all the way to chapter 50. We know a lot about Joseph. Let me just give you a little bit of background. Joseph's father was Jacob, and he was also called Israel. And sometimes in my message, I call him Israel, sometimes Jacob. My tongue slips. So either one, he's the same person, Jacob and Israel. So Joseph had 11 other brothers. Only one was younger than him, and that was Benjamin. Now, when Benjamin was born, his mother died, and that happened to be Joseph's mother also. So that must have been a tragic, trying experience for the family, but especially for Joseph, for Jacob also. And Jacob in his old age, having lost his wife Rachel and having favored his youngest sons because they were born to him in his old age, he really favored Joseph. And it says in Genesis chapter 37, verses 3 through 4, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him." So there's a little bit of tension in the family. Now, this is a big family. Joseph at this period of time is about 17 years old. And so his other older brothers are in their 20s and they're in their 30s and they're well established. But Joseph is a favorite, and to show that off, Jacob has made for him this very ornate robe or colorful robe that he wears. And I'm sure as a 17-year-old with a brand new coat and one that nobody else had, and one that showed that he was the favorite, that he probably just like strutted around, with his multicolored, very ornate coat and kind of flaunted it in front of his brothers. But his brothers just couldn't stand him. Couldn't stand him because he was the favorite. Couldn't stand him because of probably because of his pride in his new coat. And the Bible tells us that they hated him and couldn't say a kind word to him. So there's a lot of tension happening in the family. No kind words are coming back and forth, especially when it concerns Joseph. Now, on top of this jealousy that's already going on in the family, Joseph has a couple of dreams. Now, these dreams come from God, and they are something that's really going to be important for him in the distant future. But he doesn't know that. He just knows that he's received these two dreams from God. And the gist of the two dreams is that his brothers one day are going to be bowing down to him and serving him. So he tells the dream to his brothers. So his brothers already dislike him so much. They hate him. They can't say a kind word to him. And now he's telling them that he's had dreams from God, and that one day they're all going to be bowing down to him. So in Genesis 37, verse 8, it tells us that his brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and because of what he said. You've probably experienced in your lifetime or in your family some kind of favoritism happening. Or maybe you heard of a friend and the friend was talking to you about favoritism that's happening in that family. It's not an easy thing for people to handle when somebody else is the favorite and you're not the favorite. And I won't ask you to raise hands, although in the first service we had a lot of hands go up that they did have family members they thought were the favorite, and they were not the favorite, but we won't cause trouble today by asking that question again. But I'll tell you something about jealousy, because his brothers were jealous of him for being a favorite, for being more loved. And that jealousy has no positives. There is nothing good that can ever come to your life through being jealous of another person. I mean, it's 0%. It's not even like 1 or 2%. It's 0%. Nothing good can come from you being jealous of another person. Jealousy is something that happens in our own hearts, and we may have reason for it, but it's something that we should be able to deal with. We should be able to get this straightened out with God and in prayer say, God, I am jealous. I know I shouldn't have this in my heart. Please help me to get over it. And with God's help, you can get over those things. But don't let them fester. Don't let them stand in your way. If you hold on to jealousy for any reason, it will be like a cancer, and it will eat away, and it will be something that will get worse. It will never get better. So it's something just to surrender, to give to God. It's not something to hold on to. Now, sometime later in this, after Joseph had shared his dreams, the older brothers had gone out and they were tending the flocks and herds of the family in a distant location. And Jacob sent Joseph out to check on his brothers who were grazing their flocks. Well, on another previous occasion, Jacob had sent Joseph out to do this very same thing. And Joseph observed that his brothers were doing something wrong, something they shouldn't be doing. And so he came back and he reported it to Dad. So Dad got a little upset and told the brothers about it. But now this made things worse for the brothers. They didn't like their little brother coming and checking on them. And this exactly is what was going to happen on this occasion. So Joseph went out to where he thought they were grazing their flocks. There was nothing there, but there was a man there who told him, no, they've moved on. They're in another distant location. So he goes and finds them, and he finally finds his brothers. And his brothers see him walking their direction with his beautiful, multicolored, ornate coat. They could probably be seen a mile away, right, walking toward them. And as he is coming their way, they're just upset all over again. And in Genesis chapter 37, verse 18, it says, but they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him, and then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. And so we see that they hated Joseph so much that they weren't even willing to let him live any longer. Now, a cistern is something that they would have dug out in the desert, kind of like a dry well, but it would have been very wide and very deep, maybe about 12 to 15 feet deep. And a cistern is used to wait for the rains so that the water runoff from the ground would flow into the cisterns because they were placed in just the right place, and they would fill with water, and they would provide water for people and for animals for months after the rains had gone. But these were dry cisterns, and they decided that since there were cisterns nearby, that a good plan for them to kill their brothers. So here's their scheming to kill him. They are going to throw him down one of the cisterns where he can't get out on his own, and they're just going to leave him there to die. So he would die of thirst, he would die of starvation or of exposure, and they just wanted him gone. That was their plan. In Genesis 37, verse 23, it says, so when Joseph came to his brothers, They stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, and there was no water in it. So what we're seeing here, or actually the Bible tells us that after they did that, they sat down to eat. So it's like saying, now that we've decided to kill our brother, let's have lunch. What else should we do, right? Let's have lunch. So they sat down, they ate a meal, but while they were eating, in a distance, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from the land of Midian. And so these traders had camels, the Bible says, loaded with spices. And then one of the brothers said to the others, hey, let's not waste this opportunity. Why not make some profit? And so they decided they were going to sell Joseph as a slave to the Midianite traders, and that they were bound for Egypt, so he would go as a slave to Egypt, and maybe they could make some money. And so they did just that. They pulled him out of the cistern. They sold him as a slave to the Midianites, and for this slave, the Midianites gave them 20 pieces of silver. In verse 27, they said, come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. And the brothers agreed. And those are kind brothers, aren't they? To say, well, let's not kill him. He's our brother. He's our flesh and blood. Let's sell him as a slave. So if you can imagine this happening, 20 pieces of silver divided amongst the 10 older brothers, 2 pieces of silver each. They have the money jingling in their pockets as they go home, but they have to give a story to Dad. What happened to Joseph? Where's Joseph? And so they decide that they're going to make up a story, and they take his ornamented robe and they rip it to shreds and they dip it in animal blood and they take it to their father, and then they show it to their father and they say, Father, please look at this carefully. Is this the coat that you gave to Joseph? If it is, he's probably been torn to pieces by a ferocious animal, and he's dead. And so, of course, it was Joseph's coat, and Jacob was so grieved. In fact, the Bible makes a big deal out of the grief that Jacob felt at the death of what he thought was the death of his son Joseph. And these brothers, even though they saw the grief of their father, weren't willing to tell him the truth that he was still alive. And so they had to endure these months of grief as they kept this secret and this story that they had sold their brother into slavery. In Genesis 37:26, it says, meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials and the captain of the guard. Now, I can't imagine what Joseph was feeling being betrayed by his brothers and being put in shackles and now walking toward Egypt with this caravan farther and farther from home to a land that wasn't his, to where people didn't speak his language, and he was going as a slave. He didn't know what happened to slaves in Egypt, where they would end up, what he would be doing, but we see that he was probably taken to some kind of slave market. He was sold, and he happened to arrive being purchased by Potiphar, who was the captain of the guard in Egypt. And the Bible tells us that as a slave in Potiphar's house, that Joseph, even though he probably started with menial tasks, Potiphar saw that he had a lot of potential, and everything he set his hands to do prospered. And so Potiphar began to give him more and more responsibility until Joseph was in charge of all of Potiphar's household. And so he ran the whole house and the other servants and everything that had to be done in Potiphar's house. And the Bible tells us that God blessed all the work of Joseph's hands so much that Potiphar prospered because Joseph was in his employ. It's my feeling that wherever we are as Christians, that the place where we work or where we serve, that it always ought to be a better place because of who we are as Christians. That we ought to do 100%, or as the Bible says in the New Testament, working as unto the Lord, and doing things to bring him glory and to prosper the place where we work. Because if it prospers, we're going to prosper, right? And I think that's an attitude of our heart and of our mind, and sometimes we just endure where we are. But God has placed you there for a purpose. He has planted you in that exact location or that exact job or what you're doing now. But he's put you there so that that place can prosper. And by prospering and doing better, they will recognize that it's through you, through the God in you, that God is doing something special. Now, he had all of this responsibility, and that responsibility that was on his shoulders, he carried well and did good for Potiphar. But the Bible tells us in verse 39, verse 7, now Joseph was well built and handsome, like some of us used to be, right? He was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." So the problem with being in this really fancy house, the captain of the guard, with probably property and so much to take care of, that Joseph was doing such a great job. But the problem was that even though this was kind of a good life, it wasn't a good life because of Mrs. Potiphar. And Mrs. Potiphar had eyes for the good-looking servants, and being the lusty woman that she was, right? So she saw Joseph, handsome, good-looking, threw herself at him, "Sleep with me." And maybe she thought by her power and position that he would just obey, or maybe she thought she was so beautiful that he couldn't resist. Whatever it was, she tried to entice him to go to bed with her. Now, Joseph had an answer for her, and in Genesis 39, verse 9, it says, he said, "No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" So Joseph has a great answer. An answer that we should have, at least in our heart, when we're faced with temptation. And when we're faced with temptation, we need to think about a couple of things. And we need to think about, how can I betray those who have put their trust in me? How can I turn my back on those who are depending on me? And in looking toward God, how can I pretend that this does not matter to God? And how can I ignore that God has commanded me not to do this? But the Bible tells us day after day she made her advances toward Joseph. And then she conspired that one day this would be the day, she said. So she asked all of her servants to leave the house, so no one was at home, right? She put on her dress with the plunging neckline, lip gloss, high heels. I don't know. That's not in the Bible. But she was trying to do something. I'm just imagining what's happening here. So Joseph is the only one in the home making his rounds, and she throws herself at him. And she says, "Sleep with me." And Joseph has been avoiding her, but he's been trapped this day. And so he manages to get out of her hands, but as he gets out of her hands, he slips out of his coat, and she's left holding it in her arms, in her hands. And she is so upset, so infuriated that this servant of hers will not cooperate, right? That nothing she does, not even the lip gloss, could entice him to sleep with her. So being the powerful woman that she is, she's going to do something about this. If he won't give in, then he's not staying. So she makes up a story, and she calls all of her servants back in, and she said, "See this coat? This coat belongs to the man who tried to seduce me today. I screamed, but none of you were at home to hear my scream. But I managed to get away from him, but here I have his coat." And so she thought up of this false accusation against Joseph. None of it was true, of course. And it says in verse 19 and 20, "When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, 'This is how your slave treated me.' He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined." I want you to listen to me for a moment. Just because you're a Christian and you serve Jesus doesn't mean that people are not going to wrong you. You're not protected from the malintent of other people. People are going to take advantage of you. People are going to tell lies about you. People are going to undermine you. People are going to try to get ahead of you by stepping on you in life or in work or in any other situation. People are going to manipulate circumstances so that you're the bad guy. And you've probably already experienced this. But I want you to know that Jesus taught us exactly what to do. Jesus taught us, don't take vengeance into our own hands. That is, don't try to set things straight on your own. God is the one who is going to balance the scales in the end. And in fact, God says, "Vengeance is mine," says the Lord. And so sometimes it is possible to resolve conflict, to talk to people, to straighten things out, but sometimes their intent is just evil, just like Mrs. Potiphar. And in those circumstances, we come to God and we pray and we say, "Lord, this is what's happening. You know the truth of it, and you're my defender. And I just place this situation and this person or people into your hands, and you know what to do." And God promises in his word that he will be the one to set things straight, to balance the scales in the end. And if you've lost anything because of people like that, just remember that God is able to give you 10 times what they take away. He's able to bless your life and give you 10 times more than what they take away. So just leave it in God's hands and don't stress over it. Don't be the one to try to bring your own justice. Don't get back at people. If you try to get back at people, then everyone else observing will only see the second blow, your blow. They will not see what the other person did to you. And then they will think less of you. And so don't let that happen. Don't give the enemy more ammunition for you, but leave this in God's hands. Jesus told us in John 16:33, "Here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. So keep looking to the one who's the overcomer of any circumstance that could come your way. So Joseph is in prison now. He's a slave now in a prison. He's in a fancy prison. And that's not saying that it was luxurious. It was the dungeon where the king sent all of his own prisoners and political prisoners. They were put in that jail, and that's where Joseph was. The Bible tells us in another place, and we'll read that scripture later, that he was shackled around his hands and around his neck. And so this wasn't a happy place for him. But as everyone else in the jail, you just didn't sit in a cell. You worked, you cleaned up things, you did labor. And so Joseph did that. And the warden of the prison noticed that whatever Joseph put his hands to do, that he did it well. And so the warden liked him and gave him more and more responsibility. And the Bible tells us that in time, he was responsible for all the other prisoners in the prison. And by being responsible for the other prisoners, he would have gotten to know the prisoners that would be coming and going from the jail. And on one occasion, two people, the chief baker of the king and the king's cupbearer, offended the king in some way. We don't know what they did, but they offended the king. And so the king threw them into prison. Joseph got to know them. And on one occasion, as he was making his way around the prison and was talking to these two, he noticed that they were a little bit downcast that day. He noticed their attitude, and he asked them, "What's wrong? What's wrong today?" And they both told him, "We have both had a dream. And our dreams are troubling to us because we can't understand them. We don't know what they mean." That in Genesis 40, verse 8, they said, "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." And then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." I want to say for just a moment here, since Joseph had a dream, the chief baker and king's cupbearer had a dream. Later, Pharaoh's going to have a dream. In the New Testament, Joseph of the New Testament had a dream. And many other people in the New Testament had a dream that came from God. That's one of the ways that God communicates with people, is through dreams. Sometimes he communicates with people through dreams because they resist hearing his voice at other times, but when they're asleep, they can't resist his voice because he can send his message in a dream. But not all dreams that come from God are literal, and that's why many people misinterpret their dreams. Because they're thinking, "Oh, if I saw so-and-so in my dream, that means my dream is about so-and-so," but it's not true, because dreams are always symbolic. And because they're symbolic, it could be that that person is symbolic of something and not the actual subject of your dream. And I just want to say that if you dream dreams that you think are from God, then do what Joseph said. Do not interpretations belong to God. Pray about those dreams. Don't just shrug them off. If God's trying to talk to you, you don't just shrug it off. You pray and you say, "God, what are you trying to say? What are you telling me? Give me the interpretation of this dream. Please show me what you're saying." You know, sometimes the Lord speaks in parables so that we will seek him for what the parable means. And it's all about the seeking of him. And so Joseph said, "God is the one who can interpret your dreams." But he said, "Tell me your dreams." And the amazing thing to me here is that Joseph, snatched from his home, sold into slavery, wronged by his very first employer as a slave in Egypt, and in prison, has this relationship with God. This relationship probably developed through the hardship that he had gone through the many days of prayer. I imagine that as Joseph was walking his way toward Egypt with the caravan, each and every day he was praying to God, Lord, save me, help me, be with me. And sometimes when we pray that often or pray that hard or concentrate on how much we need God, that God begins to reveal himself to us. God begins to speak comfort to our hearts. God begins to speak promise, or God begins to say, I'm here. You're not alone. You're not walking alone. I'm with you. Now, Joseph knows all about dreams because he had 2 dreams of his own that were mysteries to him, although he knew they meant that his brothers would bow down before him. And so he asked about these dreams, and then Joseph gives them the interpretation of their dreams. And the interpretations are true. To the cupbearer, he says, in 3 days you're going to be restored to your master, and you will be serving your cup to Pharaoh once again. But to the baker, he says, in 3 days your head will be cut off and your body impaled on a pole. You're not leaving this place alive. And it happened exactly as Joseph interpreted those dreams. Now, before the cupbearer left the prison, Joseph asked him to remember him when he was restored to his position with Pharaoh. He said, don't forget about me here. Could you please remember me, and could you please put in a good word to Pharaoh? I'm an innocent guy. I don't belong here. I'm not even from this country. I was sold as a slave by my brothers. I've been wronged. This is not the place for me. Could you please put in a good word? Pharaoh's the only one who can do anything for me, who can change my situation. So if you don't know this story, then you're probably thinking to yourself, well, then the cupbearer told Pharaoh, and Pharaoh tried to help Joseph, but that's not what happened. The cupbearer forgot all about Joseph. The cupbearer forgot about Joseph for 1 month, for 2 months, for 6 months. Forgot about Joseph for a year, forgot about Joseph for 2 years. He forgot about Joseph. He had one job, and he forgot about Joseph, right? That was the only thing that was requested of him. Remember me when you talk to Pharaoh. Now, it says in Genesis chapter 41, verse 8 and 9, that Pharaoh had a series of 2 dreams, and those dreams troubled him greatly. And it says, in the morning his mind was troubled, and so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt, and Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. And then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I am reminded of my shortcomings. And then he told Pharaoh the story of Joseph and how Joseph had interpreted his dream and the dream of the chief baker, and that both of those dreams were interpreted correctly, and everything happened exactly as Joseph had predicted. So in verse 14 we read, so Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. And when he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And so it wasn't appropriate for Joseph just to be pulled out of prison and set in front of Pharaoh in chains. And so they would have removed his chains. He would have bathed. He would have dressed in the way of the Egyptians. They would have shaved off his beard, probably shaved his head also. And then he was ready to be presented before Pharaoh and his court. And in that way, what was happening was that Joseph, the officials who were to bring Joseph knew that Joseph had to be presented in a way that was acceptable to Pharaoh. Pharaoh just wouldn't accept people coming in any condition and seeing him. But it is also a lesson and a story for us about the world in which we live. And that is that Joseph, when he stood before Pharaoh, had to be relatable to Pharaoh. Pharaoh had to accept what he was seeing before him if he was going to be asking something of Joseph to help him. And in the same way, sometimes we as Christians, we isolate ourselves from the world. And we insulate ourselves with our own culture. We develop our own culture as Christians, our own language that only we understand. Phrases and sayings and stories that only Christians would get. And in some ways, we've made ourselves unrelatable to the world around us. But the Apostle Paul, who traveled in many places of the world, trying to take the gospel of the good news of Jesus wherever he went, he said this. He said that I tried to become all things to all men that I might save some. And so what he was saying is that when I'm with the Macedonians, I try to be like a Macedonian so that they will listen to me and hear me and maybe receive the message of Jesus. When I'm with the Greeks, I do the same. Or in Asia, I try to be relatable to the people. I try to talk to them from a point of view that they could understand. Like the time he walked into a city past many altars, and when he spoke to the people in a free forum where anyone could speak, he talked to them about their own altars. And he said, I noticed as I walked into your city that I saw an altar that said, to the unknown God. I know who that God is, he said. And he preached Jesus. But he could only do that by being relatable to the culture of the people that he was reaching. And our challenge today is to be relatable to the people that God has sent us to. Because as Jesus said, we're supposed to be salt and we're supposed to be light wherever we go. And we can't be salt and light if we just insulate ourselves so that nobody can talk to us and no one can relate to us. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he deserves. Do you just see what Joseph just did? He's been taken from a dungeon, and now he's in Pharaoh's court, standing right in front of Pharaoh and Pharaoh's throne. Joseph has been put on the stage, and he brings God to the stage. He brings God to the stage. He says, I can't do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. God's going to give you the answer of the interpretation of your dreams. You know, sometimes people share their problems, their worries, their cares with us. And we sympathize, but that's also an opportunity to bring God to the stage. I know someone who can help you. I know what can help you in this situation. And even if we just offer to pray, it says something. We're bringing God to the stage. We're changing the picture. By putting God in the mix, we give God an opportunity to do something. But we have to give God that open door. God's asking you to bring him to the stage. You need to pray for wisdom and favor in your job and do the best job possible. Ask God to give you wisdom and understanding. And then give him the credit. That God is the one who is helping you to make these decisions or find these solutions. Now Joseph listened to the dreams that God had given to Pharaoh, and he gave him this interpretation, and I'll just kind of boil it down. Joseph said, "Your dreams say," they're both one and the same message, "that we are going to have 7 years of plenty in Egypt, where there will be a lot of harvest, and then there will be 7 years of famine, and the famine will be so severe that if you don't prepare for the famine, that it will decimate the land. It will ruin Egypt if you do nothing about it." And then Joseph urged Pharaoh to find a wise and discerning man to be in charge of collecting and saving the harvest during the plenteous years, so that there would be something to eat and save the nation during the 7 years of famine. Now notice that it was a moment of favor that brought Joseph from prison to standing before Pharaoh. It was just a moment of favor. We can't ignore those moments of favor when they come to our own life. When God opens a door and we know it's God, and it's just plain as can be that God has set this whole thing up, then our job is to step forward into that moment of favor. But just because we step forward into a moment of favor doesn't mean that we'll be able to succeed unless, like Joseph, we have the wisdom to remain there. Where did Joseph get his wisdom? Where did he get his plan to save Egypt or interpret dreams? It was all with his relationship with God. His relationship with God got him that wisdom and that understanding. It was also his hardships that got him the wisdom that he had. And sometimes we don't think that the deep valleys that we go through earn us anything but pain or sorrow. But to the contrary, those deep valleys that you go to, they teach you lessons that are invaluable. They give you wisdom that you will have forever. God begins to speak to you in those dark times, and his word is like a treasure. It's like gold. And those nuggets of truth that he gives to you in the dark hours are things that you have forever in your heart to share with others, even when they're going through similar experiences that you go through. There is so much that God can do when we go through those times of difficulty. So Joseph put something on the table. You need a wise person to take care of all this for you. And then he's silent. But do you know what's happening? God's not silent. God's speaking to Pharaoh. God's touching Pharaoh's heart. God's inspiring Pharaoh to do something. I love that about God. I love that when we don't see it, he's still working. That even though evidence is not before us, he is doing something. And so he's working in Pharaoh's heart in this moment of silence as Joseph finishes the interpretation. Pharaoh's taking it all in, the meaning of the dreams, what's going to happen to Egypt, the need for a wise person. And then in Genesis 41, verse 39 and 41, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made this all known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Verse 42, then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way." And thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all Egypt. Isn't that astounding? He was a slave and a servant 1 second, and another second later, he's second in command in the entire land of Egypt. Don't underestimate the power of God to change your circumstance in a moment. You may have waited for it. Joseph waited a long time. Joseph waited 13 years from the day that he was sold into slavery till the day he stood before Pharaoh and was given this honor. 13 years of hardship. Don't give up. Don't give up that God could change your circumstance in a single moment. And you can believe that all of hell was against Joseph. That hell knew God's plan for Joseph. And for the salvation not only of Egypt, but of God's own people and his own family. And the gates of hell were against Joseph. And the schemes of hell were against Joseph all along the way. But God is able to undo all of that. It reminds me of the scripture from Isaiah chapter 45, verses 2 and 3, where the Lord says, I will go before you, and I will level the mountains, and I will break through gates of bronze, and cut through bars of iron, and I will give you the treasures of darkness, riches stored in secret places. God is able to break through the gates of hell that are trying to hold you back. Every mountain that is an obstacle to the answer to your prayers, God is the answer, and he can do it in a moment, just as he did with Joseph. And so it says in Genesis 41:46, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. So know how powerful Joseph was now. No one lifted a finger or did a thing in all of Egypt unless Joseph gave the word. And he rode this really cool chariot, probably had one of those Egyptian hats that looked really nice, you know. He showed off his six-pack abs standing on that chariot, the gold chain around his neck. You've seen Egyptians. And waving his Super Bowl ring given to him by Pharaoh as he waved to the crowd. Yes! Here comes Joseph. And everywhere he goes, he has people run before him that literally say, cast yourself down. That's the literal translation of the Hebrew. Cast yourself down as Joseph comes their way. I wonder in moments like this, when Joseph is raised to such prominence, what was Mrs. Potiphar thinking? Like, I better hide. It's like, I'm never going to let him see my face, because if he sees me, it won't go good. And I want to end by saying this, and that is that Joseph developed something deep and life-changing, walking with God through all of his difficulties. Don't waste your difficulties. Learn something. Seek God. Jot down all the lessons that he's teaching you. Journal them. Do something. But listen to him. Learn from him during those times. Joseph went through personal hell for 13 years. But God taught him about relationship to him in the secret place. Jesus taught about the secret place. He said the secret place is that place where you meet alone with God, where no one else can see, but where God sees and God rewards. It's where you speak with him one-on-one, and he teaches you and fellowships with you. Joseph learned in the secret place so many lessons from the Heavenly Father. And he probably had so many questions. Where's your secret place? It could be your kitchen counter. It could be your prayer chair, your car. outdoors somewhere. But when Joseph was far from his father in Canaan, God became a father to him. He didn't have a Bible. There was no Bible written yet. No Caleb radio, no iTunes with cool music to inspire our hearts. But he had the Holy Spirit as his teacher. And as it says in Isaiah 54:13, all your sons will be taught by the Lord, and great will be your children's peace. I encourage you, parents, keep praying for your children. Joseph was torn away from his family who believed in God at age 17. And then he had no other teacher but God. But if you teach things to your children, they will not forget it. Because God hides it within their heart, and the Holy Spirit brings it out just the moment that they need it. So the moment they need to cry to help, they're going to cry to God. The moment that they need a truth or a lesson, they're going to pull up the truths that are in their hearts. Things taught them at an early age. It is a powerful investment that we make in our children. And praying for them ensures that the voice of the Holy Spirit, the voice of God, continues in their life, even if they are struggling. During those times of one-on-one conversation, Joseph learned God's voice. That's how he learned how to listen so that he could interpret dreams. God taught Joseph his identity as a son. And you too can spend many years thinking that you're a prisoner, you're a slave, you're a victim, or a forgotten one, until God shows you who you really are. That you're his daughter, or you're his son. And then nothing can take that away, because nothing can take him away from you. Can life or death, or this life or the next, or any power on heaven or earth take the love of God from you? No. The scripture says no. That's who you really are. If you're downcast and you're thinking that you are the forgotten one, or that God has forsaken you, then remember Joseph's story. In Psalm 105, verse 18 and 19, it says of Joseph, they bruised his feet with shackles, his neck was put in irons, till what he foretold came to pass, until the word of the Lord proved him true. You might be thinking that God has forsaken you. If Joseph thought God forsook him when he was sold into slavery, the truth was that God saved him from the murderous hands of his brothers. His salvation was being put into slavery. If Joseph thought that God forsook him when Potiphar sent him to prison unjustly, then the truth is that God saved him from the household of Potiphar, where he probably would have been discovered if he had committed immorality and had been put to death. And so prison saved his life. If Joseph had thought that God forsook him when the cupbearer forgot to put in a good word to Pharaoh, the truth was that God was preparing Pharaoh to accept Joseph. God's always working behind the scenes, and his plan for you is good. I'm reminded of the words of that song, even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop. You never stop working. If the worship team could come. The fact is that God is not just working his will in you, but he's working his will around you. Have you ever thought of the bigger picture? You see, God wasn't only thinking about the salvation of Joseph, saving Joseph, but God wanted to save a country. God wanted to save his own people that would become a great nation upon the earth. God was going to do all that through Joseph, the bigger picture. And sometimes we're too focused on the small picture, that it's just us, it's just our needs or just our problems, but God has a bigger picture. Let's stand together. Are you in a valley right now? Have you been waiting for promises to be fulfilled? Do you feel forgotten? Or do you feel that in some way or another, God slipped up and is the cause of some of your pain? But God's going to erase all the pain of the past. God's going to erase all the injustice of the past. Because He has a great big plan. His picture is big. And it's true what it says in His Word, that He can work all things to the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purposes. God has a plan for you. He loves you. It's all going to be okay. I invite you, if you want to spend some time at the altar for a moment.
Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running, it keeps running after me. You're running after me. You're running after me. God, you're running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Oh, every time your goodness is running after, it's running after me.
Thank you for coming this morning. You can stay and worship and pray as long as you want. God bless you.